Okay, I have 1 o'clock on the dot, and I see we already have 300 participants, and they're still joining. But we'll go ahead and get started because we want to get into the meat of things. Again, this is you're here for managing forests habitat in a changing world. It's a panel discussion series, but today we're specifically talking about regen reforestation and regeneration for wildlife, and this is sustaining forests in under changing environmental conditions. And again, our speakers today are Tony D'Amato, Carrie Pike, Olivia LeDee, and Chuck Hunter. With that, I'll turn it over to Gwyneth to talk a little bit about the upfront things to do and the technology pieces. Go ahead, Gwyneth. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Conservation Training Center here in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Gwyneth Daunton, and today's webinar is on forest and regeneration for wildlife and sustaining forests in changing environmental conditions. We have some wonderful speakers today, and we'll introduce them later. Just to get you started up, we do have closed captioning available from our wonderful captioner. And if you need that, let us know and we can help you out. We also have wonderful ASL interpreters as well. And so please make sure to use those if you need them. We would like to start with our land acknowledgement here at the National Conservation Training Center. We acknowledge that we are on unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous people. While we could not find the full account, we are aware that many of these people traversed, cherished, and lived on these lands. These people include, but are not limited to, the Massawomac, Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. Here at the Conservation Training Center, we also welcome everyone. We acknowledge our agents' histories and strive to be a site of cultural transformation for our organization and larger conservation community, making it more representative of inspirations of the American people. Please let me know how I can assist you in that goal. A quick disclaimer, the views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mentions of any product name, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. Just a quick thing. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat, that would be great. But if you do have questions, you should put that in the question box instead, in the little Q&A box that's all the way to the right next to raise a hand. And so you should use that to be able to ask us questions during this conversation, and we will be checking those regularly. We are also on air, so everything is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube later for everyone else to see who couldn't join us today. Last but not least, from me at least, if you want to be viewing this properly and see all of our wonderful faces, you should have your view in gallery, which is, you click view, which is on in this image in the top right-hand side. It looks like a bunch of little boxes together. And once you click on that, you should be in gallery. And that should give you the best view of all of us. All right, Jeff, your turn to take it away.
Thank you, Gwyneth. So, just wanted to say a little bit about the series itself. We've been doing this series for the last 6 years. And so basically the series is sponsored by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, particularly the Forest Ecology Working Group, also our science applications, migratory birds programs, and of course the National Conservation Training Center helps us a great deal in making sure this happens. But we also have the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has been huge in helping us put these series on. And this particular year, this series has been coordinated by Amanda Mahaffey and Lindsay Grayson, also assisted by Haven Barnhill and myself, Jeff Horan. And I also want to give Amanda Mahaffey just huge credit for keeping us moving through this and really kind of leading this effort along with Lindsay. And I have to say, Amanda, who is our forest ecologist in the Northeast region, she was part of the those who lost their positions on Friday. It's a shame because she has done such an incredible job. So I just wanted to say that. So we're going to keep moving. Next slide, please. Also, if you guys need credits for SAF credits or the Wildlife Society is you just tell them you attended. But if it's SAF, you can send Jim Siegel a note and he'll get back to you on that. This is a 12-part series and it features interactive discussions. And we are looking into climate shifts. We're looking into forest habitat changes. We're looking at how we can adapt to these things in our environment. So the panels represent scientists, they represent natural resource managers, and we provide examples of ecological silviculture, restoration actions, and collaborative conservation stories. This is the second in the 12-part series, and our next up is a month from today, and that's March 17th, and it's going to be forest dwelling bat conservation. So I hope you can join us then. But for now, let's keep moving into our panel. So today's panel is Dr. Tony D'Amato, Carolyn Pike, Olivia LeDee, and Chuck Hunter. And I'm going to be your moderator. So go ahead, Tony. And if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about yourself when we get started, that would be great. Again, we're going to hear from each of our panelists for a bit, and then we're going to come back around. And you guys can start putting questions in the Q&A as soon as you get them, so that we can begin to digest them, and we'll send them around later in the conversation. Thank you. Go ahead, Tony.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. Those coming from the West Coast, and appreciate such a large group logging on today. And also, like Jeff, want to acknowledge Amanda's amazingness and appreciate all she's done to organize this and bring us together here today. As was discussed as part of our introduction, so I'm the director of the forestry program here at the University of Vermont. And one of the things they asked us to bring up is what got us into forest regeneration. And so I think inherently most of our first experiences with nature might be like germinating a lima bean or something in paper towels or other science experiments. And so I think, growing things and watching, seeds become small plants to become large trees is always something that brings a lot of wonder to us and in our lives. And so I guess I'd say from a personal standpoint, that's my connection. But professionally, working in silviculture, I always joke with my students when I show them a picture of a lot of regen, the person always has a big smile on their face because that is definitely something that we're trying to do in sustainable stewardship. And so today what I'm going to do is just set the stage. Each of us will have kind of a short presentation, and mine is really just to kind of give some context for thinking about reforestation and regeneration in a changing environment. And so regardless of where you're logging into from today, obviously there's either a too wet year, too dry year, too warm year, or a radically warm year that's affected you, particularly during the growing season. And so as we think about changing, climate conditions and what that means for regeneration, it really creates an even greater bottleneck over one of the most challenging things we do in our job, which is successfully regenerate species. At the same time, as the bottom left-hand figure shows, particularly for the Western US, many are already living this, but it's only projected to get greater in scale in terms of the amount of wildfire, the scale of wildfire. And what that does is certainly present a very challenging context to regenerate, both lack of seed sources, huge areas with exposed conditions that are just a challenging environment for trees to grow in, let alone have reforestation crews over large areas. And then the region that I work in the Northeast, the figure on the right is just some older summaries of just the level of mortality from areas that have had emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid for over a decade. And at this point, just these two organisms alone, they estimate the annual mortality emits over 400,000 cars worth of emissions in carbon. And so we're seeing major changes in our forests that really are causing some concern over what's going to come back and how we reforest those areas. You can advance the slide. Gwen, if you can go to the next slide. So when we think about change and adaptation to conditions, it really is in the the regeneration layer that we think of where that change is occurring. And there's different ways to look at this and to evaluate current forest conditions and if they are actually poised to recover and rebound successfully, evolve with these increases in mortality and these changes in environmental conditions. And so the figure on the left is from some work that Kevin Potter led, looking at just the ability of the current sapling layer to replace the overstory, and really identified a lot of regions of our country have at least 1 to 2, if not 19 to 20 species that currently don't have adequate regeneration to replace them if we were to lose those trees today from the landscape. You'll notice just based on the patterns, obviously the Ohio Valley region, southeastern US, where there's a wider range of species, we also have many more opportunities for loss. But in the West, where we might have just a few species representing the forest, even losing a couple and losing the genetic variability from that landscape is a huge challenge. So certainly something many of us are well aware of. Likewise, the figure on the right is just illustrating one of many dynamics we're concerned about as it relates to changes in our forest and possibly shifts in the regeneration potential of these ecosystems. And Carrie will certainly be talking, as well as Chuck and Olivia, about both ways to counterbalance this as well as ways in which this influences habitat. But one simple thing to look at is if we start losing more and more trees to overstory mortality and shift to many of the species that are now predominating in the understory, whether that's red maple or beech, the shift that causes in terms of above ground carbon actually is quite significant and might actually lead to lower levels of carbon stocking on the landscape. So certainly a value that we're trying to adapt and sustain. Gwen, if you can advance to the last slide. So many of you that are logging in, and certainly others in the panel, really put a lot of effort into figuring out how do we both address these regeneration deficits, address changing conditions, trying to adapt our practices in the landscape. And that can range from just trying to do careful stewardship with natural regeneration, trying to conserve seed sources, trying to favor slower developing species by protecting advanced regen. It might entail reintroducing fire, reintroducing other disturbances to the landscape. And certainly it might entail investments like, slash walls or other things that require pretty significant effort to try to keep trees growing on the ground. But more often than not, it revolves around thinking about new ways of reforesting and regenerating. And in our part of the world, includes a lot more planting than anybody was thinking about 10 years ago. And so it raises some questions about, if we're going to do this and do this at large scales, how do we go about doing it in a way that's informed by best practice? And so I'm fortunate to be able to hand it off to somebody that can talk about best practice and thinking about seed zones, et cetera, and hand it over to Carrie to talk a bit more about her realm and how to go about doing some of this. So, Carrie, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Tony. So you can go to the next slide, Gwyneth. So my name is Carrie Pike. I didn't make an intro slide. I'm with USDA Forest Service and with the Eastern Region. So I cover the 20-state Eastern Region, and I work for the State Private and Tribal Forestry Deputy Area. So I work primarily with partners. My background is in forest genetics. So Tony talked about tree planting and how we're doing that more and more. And so if you know you're going to plant trees and if you've identified the species you want to use, then the next question that you need to drill down to is, what seed source do I use? And why does the seed source matter anyway? And the picture in front of you on the right side is a common garden study of lodgepole pine. It was planted in large blocks. You can see the different disparity in the blocks. Some of them had excellent survival. Some of them had really poor survival. And the reason for this is twofold. One, trees, most of our species have very large geographic ranges. They occur across the continent, and there's a ton of genetic variation. Trees are very, very good at getting their gametes and their seeds scattered across the landscape, and so there's a lot of material. In addition, because they occur across such large areas, they're also evolving, different populations are evolving to the conditions on those sites, leading to some population structure. And that's sort of what you see here. You can see the evidence of like decades and generations of evolution happening, shaping and refining some of our populations. Next slide. There should be another graphic on the left. I did not realize I had animations in this. Sorry. Okay. So what the lesson is that if a seed is moved too far from its origin, you risk the possibility of having poor growth, poor survival, just like you see here on the right. Now we mitigate that. Historically, we knew this. And so we've mitigated this by adopting the practice to just use your local seed source. And so what is local? We'll go to the next slide for that. So this is a map. This is a fairly new map that we developed in 2020 of the eastern seed zones for the US. There was not a map that we were using previously, and the link is in the chat. And we developed this map just out of the need for seed zones that we can use in the east. It was developed with 2 layers. The first one is the plant hardiness zones, which is the average minimum temperature. We snapped them to county lines, and then we overlaid them with the Bailey's ecoregions that were also snapped to county lines, and those were overlaid. So the polygons that you see are basically climate envelopes. So for example, if you look in western Iowa, you can see there's a 50. Well, all of the counties in that purple number 50 have basically the same climate envelope. You can move them up and down and around within the seed zone without too much concern about seeing mismatch like you saw in that first slide. Now you'll notice that some of the seed zones are fairly long. So for collectors who collect across large swaths of the US, we recommend naming that seed source by the number and the state, because we know, for example, you're not going to move seed from North Carolina all the way down to Mississippi. And so by using the state, you can guardrail it so that you're not accidentally moving seed inappropriately far. But if you need a cheap way, easy way to determine, like, how do I select seed for climate adaptation, you can go one seed collection zone to your south to any location on the map, and that seed source will be a little bit warmer, or go to a warmer hardiness zone, and that will give you the genetic diversity that you need in your seed lot to allow it to increase the probability that it is going to be successful in the future as the climate continues to warm. Next slide, please. If you want to do this a little bit more refined, there's a tool. CBI, Conservation Biology Institute, developed it in partnership with the US Forest Service. It is called the Seed Lot Selection Tool. The link is in the chat. With this, you can drop a pin on a map and it will highlight, based on parameters you choose on the left side, it will highlight the area that has the climate match, the climate analog for the future that you, based on the time frame that you put in. So you can see for this pin that I put in Minnesota, that orange area is the closest analog to the future climate. So you can collect seed from those areas. Now, the seed lot selection tool is species neutral. It does not know the range of the species that you're working with. So it's just matching a location with a climate analog. It's your job to figure out if there are actually trees with a seed in those areas. We did add Little's range maps to these for some species, so you can overlay those on the end, and you can see if, in fact, there's a likelihood that where it's directing you, there you may find trees of that species. But this tool can be used to make those refinements. So next slide, please. This is actually my last slide. So any way you do it, though, you're going to be moving seed if you want to do climate adaptation, maybe outside your seed collection zone, although you can keep it within your zone and just move it from south to north within your zone. But there's a lot of questions about, like, how far is too far, and the cost, again, go back to that first slide, can be steep. So we created this guidebook that should have the link in the chat. This guidebook, we developed species profiles for 13 major tree species. We chose species that had provenance trials done, so we know how far seed can be moved based on common garden studies. We understand their population genetics. So we have 13 species profiled, 10 mini profiles. We have a section on genetics, seed transfer, and forest health for each one of these. And the idea is to put guardrails up for you. And so for each species, we describe whether it is sensitive to seed transfer, meaning you don't want to move it more than 100 or 200 miles. If it's intermediate, there really isn't data to say that this is a species that's sensitive to movement, or if it's very tolerant, and we know from provenance trials you can move it at least 300 miles or more. So that guidebook is available. But all of this falls into the target plant concept. I think there should be a link coming. Number 3 on the target plant concept is selecting the right seed source. This is a framework that is set up, and you can learn more about it. It's a whole other webinar. to help maximize the success of your restoration or reforestation efforts. It gives you a framework of all the things to think about to ensure your success is likely. That's all I've got.
Okay, Olivia is up next. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, great to hear from everyone. Hi, my name is Olivia LeDee. I'm the Regional Administrator for the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and I'm with U.S. Geological Survey. And my charge here today is really to step back and think about the impacts of climate change on fish and wildlife in forested systems and what we can do about it. And really, my passion is in management and conservation interventions that we can do now and in the future to reduce the effects of climate change. Our center does research on the impacts and adaptation for fish, wildlife, water, lands, and people in response to climate change. And really, we'll have the link in the chat. I encourage you to reach out and connect with the Climate Adaptation Science Center more. But I just wanted to start basically with why I care about fish and wildlife. We are a diverse group of people here today. And for those of you who may not work completely in the fish or wildlife realm, you know, Fish and Wildlife Service has done a long-term study on the economic benefits of hunting, fishing, and wildlife viewing, contributing billions of dollars to the U.S. economy. We know that greater biodiversity is associated with human well-being. Also recognizing that fish, wildlife, and plants are considered relatives for some communities. And the actions that folks take in forest management can directly influence the outcomes for fish and wildlife under climate change. And so that's what I really want to talk about today. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about some big picture concepts. Oh, I also have animations. I'm with you, Carrie. So keep going, hit them till the end of this slide, please. So, and I think you can stop there. Top right is a classic study on warblers showing how uniquely differentiated they are in using forested systems, right? So you have species that are evolved for particular use of forests. And on the left, we see future declines in particular species with real concerns for arboreal species, that these and other birds are dependent upon. And we anticipate large shifts in the composition, so what species we see, and the abundance of boreal birds caused by these long-term declines or significant declines in forested area, particularly coniferous and old-growth stands. And this study also simulated how harvest intensity then affected those outcomes for those bird species as well. And those intensive harvesting accelerated declines in those species. Next slide, please. So that's structure and cover, one of the key concepts to think about for wildlife. Okay, and if you can hit it up again. There we go, thank you. Thinking about food and water, also really important. So you think about those brush piles, that coarse woody debris is more important than some folks might think for wildlife on the landscape. Water is limiting factor. And if you think about affecting their breeding ability, their movement, overwintering, and what we do in terms of harvest methods that affect the amount of ground cover really can influence the desiccation risk. And so the panel that you see in the middle is looking at the available soil moisture and desiccation risk based on the type of pine plantation it is and the effect on amphibians. And so knowing that sort of we can promote the persistence of amphibians, again, really sensitive to soil moisture conditions based on how we manage forest ground cover. So small decisions or moderate decisions can be beneficial for fish and wildlife on the landscape. Next slide, please. And a couple more times. So this is an example from Australia and looking at large-scale disturbances and especially thinking about wildfire and its role on the landscape and showing that the major movements and impacts, especially for threatened and endangered species due to wildfire risk and how it can drastically increase their likelihood of going extinct due to these large-scale disturbance events. And so thinking about wildfire policy and management, especially thinking about the immobile wildlife species on the landscape. Next slide. Can't forget about our fish. So also thinking about canopy, vegetation, riparian conditions, and the importance of those pieces on the landscape, especially as we're thinking about warming stream conditions. And so knowing that restoration activity on the channel can offset some of those projected changes to fish populations. And then one more, also for our fish friends, really relevant, is infrastructure. So we know that infrastructure can act as a barrier to movement for fish. We also know that due to increased rainfall events, that the stability and suitability of certain designs are no longer, and this is work that was done to manage the future bankfill widths for culvert designs, improving the likelihood of persistence for fish species. So a few areas to consider: both structure cover, food and water, disturbance, not forgetting about fish in terms of riparian vegetation, and then thinking about infrastructure and the role of infrastructure on the landscape for fish and wildlife. Look forward to talking to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Chuck, if you can talk a little bit about how we look at this on our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuges and beyond. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jeff, and enjoyed the wombat picture. My name is Chuck Hunter. I'm the regional refuge biologist for National Wildlife Refuges, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Wildlife Refuge System in the Southeast. I grew up in the Southeast during the 60s and 70s. I was interested in birding and herping and those sorts of things, and I didn't have a full appreciation for pines, because a lot of what I saw were, the recently, regenerating plantations, and I knew we had to go to some special places to see species like red cockaded woodpecker, but I just didn't get a real feel for the importance of fire. Of course, the era of Smokey Bear and things like that. It wasn't until I worked out west for a decade that I got much more appreciation for fire, and both the destructive forces as well as the rejuvenating forces that fire can bring. So when I came back to the Southeast, got involved with a lot of longleaf issues, but also with forested wetlands, and I'm going to highlight some information there. So when I first went on a refuge review to look at forest management practices, I guess my first question was, we actually cut trees on refuges? It was a little bit of a eye-opener. But as I understood the objectives, I also understood the reasons why, it became very clear that not only were we doing this at the time, mostly for waterfowl, deer, turkey, that sort of thing, but it was also really important to be managing these forests for structure, for vertical and horizontal complexity, for non-game species as well. And so don't need to memorize this chart, but it just basically is a chart that allows us to gauge the whether we're achieving a broad range of objectives. This will be hopefully a link, and we'll go to the next slide. And so one of the key things that we became to realize is that most of our forests, bottomland hardwoods, and true for upland forests as well, are in mid-successional condition, which is based on whatever's happened in the past. The majority of forest condition that we have is closed canopy, very little structure. It's pleasant to walk through, it's shady, it's all that good stuff, but it's not particularly good for a lot of the more vulnerable species of wildlife. And so when we started getting into the management practices and bottomland hardwoods and understanding what was the range available to us, became a real big fan for opening the canopy. And as a friend of mine would say, foresters are managers of light. And this is going to be important for making sure you're getting the right mix of species coming in. Our focus often is on the hard-mast species because they're often shade intolerant, making sure the openings are large enough to produce those, but then also canebrake and other things like that to make sure there's structure for species like Swainson's warwick woodcock, and even bears in the Southeast will den in canebrakes. Next slide. And so all those numbers you saw earlier were really amounting to considerations for a wide range of species, from the cerulean warbler that requires canopy gaps, but very tall emergent trees, to salamanders and invertebrates, with coarse down woody debris, dent trees. Bears will use cane brakes, but they'll use big snags, and a lot of species use the smaller cavities, bats, wood ducks, etc. We'll go to the next slide. And so a featured species here is the cerulean warbler, that is really very hard to figure out what's going on with it. A lot of neotropical migrants, there may be issues in the tropics that are causing some population declines. But we also noticed when we did a lot of canopy openings, both in bottomlands and in hardwoods, we found that cerulean warblers would actually be attracted to those situations and actually increase their local abundance. So again, it's a matter of managing for the structure as well as species composition. Now, cerulean warbler is a species that used to be breeding as far south as central Louisiana, Mississippi, but there seems to be some movement to the northeast, which may be climate change related independent of forest structure. Next slide. And the other major habitat type, again, open pine. Again, don't worry about all the verbiage here. But again, it's to try to look at different factors that are important for the different groups of species associated with open pine. I think we'll have a link for this one as well. If not, you can contact me by through fishandwildlife.gov. Next slide. And again, it's the same kind of thing, except in reverse. Here, we're not looking for structure in the mid-story and understory beyond regeneration. The main issue is on the canopy and the ground cover. And it's important to make sure we're maintaining as much as we can grassy herbaceous ground cover in a lot of our open pine situations, in particular longleaf pine. Next slide. And again, that translates to these sorts of factors that we consider in trying to provide a range of conditions to support these species. And I have ephemeral wetlands here, which is probably the hardest thing to manage. I saw Dan Frisk, project leader for St. Mark's, is attending. This is for you, flatwood salamander at St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. But at any rate, the bottom line is we want to promote as much ground cover as we can in grassy herbaceous condition. That requires fire. Having the trees that are supporting red heart disease for red cockaded woodpecker, coarse down woody debris for a lot of the other herps, soil service series, et cetera, for a gopher tortoise and pocket gopher. Now, longleaf pine itself is interesting in that it ranges everything from flatwoods to sandhills to the mountains. And so when we think about tree species migration, longleaf may actually be a pretty adaptable species given the different range of conditions that might happen. Next slide. And one of the biggest challenges is deciding in restoration what kind of tree densities we should be promoting. If you were industry, you plant really, really dense. If you're interested only in gopher tortoise, you might plant very sparse. But when you look at what onto the right-hand slide, it's probably something in between with longleaf regeneration, where you have dense clumps with alternated with openings. But this is one of the biggest challenges we have today in terms of trying to figure out how best to mix in the different habitat conditions and regeneration. Next slide. And this is one of my featured species with Bachman sparrow. So even though we're doing a lot of burning and we're doing a lot of habitat that should be benefiting Bachman sparrow, may not be doing quite enough through much of the southeast, with the red indicating declining trends over much of the range. So this is a challenge that we need to be thinking about for species like Bachman sparrow, bobwhite quail, of course, is in the mix. And the bottom line is that we have a lot of challenges, and with the tree species that Tony showed in the southeast, yes, we have high diversity, but we also have high risk for species loss. And we need to be keeping track of different species that are responding. And the biggest challenges we have are having species like maple take over in the bottoms and becoming the dominant tree and not necessarily the best choice. So I will stop there. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chuck. That was a great job of connecting, the forest to the wildlife. And so now, so we're about halfway through the presentation piece here, but we want to kind of generate a conversation among some of these key points. And then at 1 o'clock, we'll start looking at the questions that you folks are asking. So again, at this point, we're going to continue on our themes and move around the folks. And Tony, so as Carrie was speaking, I was seeing her, she mentioned, okay, maybe a rule of thumb is you can go one seed collection zone to the south, if we're thinking about assisted migration or something like that. I have a feeling that some of the research that you're doing, I think you're reaching down further than that, but I'll let you speak to that. But also, things come up that you think about mesophication of the species. We've heard a little bit, when you think about the beech, when you think about the maple, certainly those issues come up. And then I also, as we move, into some of, as we get down to Olivia and Chuck, some of these phenological differences that are out there when you have birds migrating north and the plant species are adjusting in a different way. So those are some of the things we might hit, but we'll start moving around. And Tony, you can start it. We don't necessarily have to go in the same order, but it probably will serve us. So keep on rolling. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a great question in terms of, what Carrie's, was presenting. And I think, most of us, really agree with, as best practice, for thinking about if we're going to be sourcing trees and moving them, really how far should we be doing that? And I think the reality is that in many regions, we don't have the capacity to actually follow that guidance. And so the work that we do that is pulling a tree, from a source that's further away is largely because that's the only place we can find a grower that has it. And so I think, right now, and Carrie can speak better to this than I can. I mean, just a huge bottleneck in reforestation, across the country, across the globe. But part of that bottleneck is not just, quantity, but really it's the diversity of sources that we can get and kind of fine tune. And so in certain regions where there's a long history of both seed source control as well as, seedling production, it's kind of ingrained in practice. And there's also availability to some degree of diverse sources for a given species that allows you to do that. But in our region, where, at least for the past 80 years, people have been more excited about natural regen than planting. And we've, lost, most of the state nurseries. Many of our private nurseries are pretty small and kind of specialized. There's just not that opportunity. So I think, I really think it's important that Carrie gets the message out more broadly, especially to kind of policymakers that are thinking about like grand reforestation initiatives that, if they're going to do that, there needs to be, I think, a funding flow behind that allows growers to produce the seedlings we need. Because right now it's just we're grabbing what we can get. And there's a few species we feel really great about being able to get fine-tuned sources for, but many it's pretty limited, including species historically that weren't important commercially. And so you just don't have a lot of sources for like swamp white oak or some of those tree species. So I don't care if you want to, you're more ear to the ground on that stuff than I am, but yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's the job of the researchers to challenge, the assumptions, to test the range, to test the limits. Our provenance trials have done a very poor job of testing the actual limits of seed transfer because we put these common garden studies very safely within the center of the range. We don't put them on these range edges. We don't want them to fail because they're so expensive to install. So it's the job of researchers to test those and move things around further than we might recommend for a manager. So the guidelines that I provide are like, this we know will work for you, but researchers need to continue to test that envelope because yes, seed is the bottleneck. Most of our nurseries, they'll grow one type of like black walnut. They're not going to grow 3 different fields of black walnut from 3 different parts of the range. They got one black walnut seed source. That's it. Some do, but it's in general a lot of contract growing. And so if you're buying seed speculatively, you're at the mercy of what you can get. And that's very, very limited. And Tony's absolutely right. And so if you're lucky, if you can get the species you want, you often don't have a chance to tailor it to get the seed source within the species. So that is a huge problem everywhere.
So that's great. Olivia, can you touch on maybe the kind of these phenological disconnects, how that if we're out there doing assisted migration or something like, how is that going to affect some of our wildlife species?
Yeah, I'll say broadly, it's an area that we are only recently sort of starting to study is sort of novel species compositions and the impacts of those on native wildlife. And there's just not enough data just yet to know the impacts. But yeah, we are concerned not only about phenological changes, but also mismatch between prey, again, desiccation, nest success. And so it might be more subtle changes of lowered nest or reproductive success or lowered survival that long term affects the trajectory of a population versus sort of more sort of in your face changes that we might expect. But I'd be curious to see what Chuck has to say about that.
Yeah, if you don't mind. Thanks, Olivia. Your last comment is an important one. I think, talking about, for instance, neotropical migrant songbirds, there's a growing body of knowledge that indicates changes in phenology of insect abundance, becoming maybe peaking before the songbirds come back from the tropics, which is a growing issue that affects exactly what you're talking about in terms of fecundity. I think of a lot of the variation that we need to be considering going back to bottleneck hardwoods. Tony talked about, wet cycles, dry cycles. Well, we have those now. And the question is, will it tilt certain directions for long periods of time, in which case you might, see further elimination of certain tree species. We think about the diversity of oaks we have in the Southeast. And oftentimes we're talking about, should we favor willow oak over nuttall oak or whatever, northern red oak. They're all produce the smaller acorns that are most important for waterfowl, but for songbirds, they're oaks. Doesn't matter which species. But those are the kinds of things we'd be talking about as well. So I think there definitely are concerns about phenological changes and disruptions of communities.
Thanks, Chuck. And so, Carrie, did you want to say something? It looked like you're right. Just give me 1 second, then we'll come back to you. So we don't have to stay in the same order. I really do want you guys are experts on this stuff. So when somebody says something and when it piques an interest in you, let's talk about that. But I did want to get us into a little bit to think about policy of these things. So Tony mentioned a little bit about the state nurseries, for instance, that don't exist. I remember when I worked for the state of Maryland, and it was my responsibility to. I didn't manage a nursery, but we had a state nursery, and so we had a highway was going to go right through the middle of our nursery, so we had to really fight to be able to get that nursery to build a new nursery, and it was interesting. A lot of the nurserymen that had come in and we're building new nurseries to address things like wetland mitigation and forest mitigation. A lot of that due to policies, state policies that created a whole new business for these niche nurseries, right? But it also impacted. There was state nurseries lost support for lots of reasons. Tony mentioned some of those, but there's a role of policy there. It had a lot of effect, and we're in a place right now where policy, where government policy is not, it is losing its grip, and so, but it has impact. So we just might, say a little bit about that too. But again, I want to keep us moving on things that pique people's interest. But I did want to push in the policy piece. Carrie, you were going to say something to Chuck, I think.
No, I'm good. I was looking something up.
Okay. So again, if anybody wants to hit on any of those, if you look at the Northeast, for instance, I think there's only New Hampshire that has a state forest nursery anymore. And again,
New York State does too.
Yeah, New York State does too. That's right. But I mean, they used to all have nurseries. Now, again, they didn't have extremely limited unlimited sources, right? They're genetic, they were looking at a narrow zone of genetics for what they were producing, and it's really hard for nurseries to produce hardwood species. I watched our nursery manager try to do that, and it's it's super challenging. But at any rate, so go ahead, you guys. I'll let you run.
Well, I'll jump in and talk about tree species that was dominant over much of the East that has essentially disappeared, and there are various attempts to try to see if we can bring it back, and that's American chestnut. And that gets into some policy about genetically modified or genetically engineered organisms, and what does that mean for trying to bring back an iconic species that we talk a lot about oaks and acorns that but compared to that, chestnuts were really the food for wildlife and of course Native Americans, and really reliable producer of mast, and it's just gone from since early 1900s. And so there are there's a lot of interest in seeing if we can reestablish American chestnut, whether there's some hybrid with Chinese or some genetically engineered form, but there's also a lot of considerations about whether we should be purposely just spreading such things willy-nilly, especially if you do have a few remnant surviving American chestnut. And so these are strong considerations that we need to be thinking about. That's sort of on the policy edge, I'd say.
Thank you, Chuck. Anybody want to jump in?
I will say there is another group besides the American Chestnut Foundation called the American Chestnut Cooperative Foundation, ACCF, and they have had some luck breeding pure American chestnuts with increased resistance. Now, they have a narrow genetic pool, but I saw some of their chestnuts. They were huge, they were full of nuts, and they were gorgeous. So there may be other alternatives. Yeah, there may be alternatives to GMOs and to hybrids.
Yep.
We also run into these challenges when we want to, for instance, you think of hemlock woolly adelgid that was absolutely crushing our hemlock populations, and it was interesting. I just was listening to a speaker from Connecticut, and their hemlock is just doing great in Connecticut, and mostly that is because of the predatory beetles that they released, and those predatory beetles are not native beetles, so they, in this case, they're the Japanese Sagittarius, I think is the but again, that we would have trouble releasing those. Well, again, you have to get permits for releasing those. It has to be monophagous on the species you are releasing it to predate, and so those kind of impacts are huge. But it's been very successful. It takes years, though, to even realize that. Same with the spongy moth impacts. It took us years to see the impacts of the fungus on spongy moth. I'll leave it there.
The other consideration I would think about as we're thinking about new species compositions is just a reminder on sort of structure and the importance of structure and microclimate for wildlife. And knowing that sort of everything from sort of density to height to cover all influence those conditions. And if we think about things that are especially sensitive, like moose, right, to both the composition of understory and the proximity to wetlands, also thinking about that as we think about novel species or new seed types.
Tony, I was wondering, again, you may have something else you want to hit on, but I was thinking about impacts. Oh my goodness, it just flew out of my head. So I'll come back to it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just would follow up on both Chuck and Olivia's point. I mean, I think a lot of how we look at planting, in the context of adaptation is, if we're going to put a different species on a site, really it's because we're trying to preserve a function that's going to be lost. And so, whether it's if we're going to lose beech to beech leaf disease, in areas where it's the only hard mass producing tree, should we be thinking about other, producers, other species that we can put out there? And likewise, you brought up hemlock woolly algid, and there's been a lot of work, looking, in Pennsylvania specifically, what other species can we potentially plant, on, I know Pennsylvania Game Commission's, name came up on some of their lands to try to sustain thermal cover, foraging, surface, et cetera. And so it becomes tricky, and sometimes even puts you in a weird space because, Dave King did some cool work that showed Norway spruce plantations had similar bird assemblages as hemlock, and that's such a, out there thought. But I think sometimes when you're faced with no other option, do we have to broaden how we're thinking about this? I'm not saying we should per se, but I think to Olivia's point, if you're looking solely at the function and there's no other species that can sustain that function, it becomes tough to figure out a way to keep that structure on the landscape if there's an insect or a climate stress that's going to eliminate it. So, but I think that's the key piece is, really thinking through is not just planting red oak because you like planting it, but does it make sense? Is it going to provide some redundancy to something else that we're losing due to climate or other disturbances?
Yeah, thermal impact to brook trout. I mean, that's a huge issue. Hemlock really, there was nothing, again, there's no substitute to keep those stream temperatures within the range brook trout can tolerate.
Yeah, let me follow up on a point that Tony made. And I'd be remiss not to talk about both the challenges and the opportunities of working with the private sector, timber forest companies, private timberlands. While it's not quite the same as, where your objective is wildlife or your objective is forest ecology or whatever, there's still major elements that the private sector can provide too, mixing and matching of age classes and that sort of thing. That still, like for instance, Swainson's warbler is still a very uncommon species, but in the right situation, it'll definitely take advantage of industrial forests. Very limited, in terms of the site. It's got to be the right site. Relatively moist area. For their vertebrate prey, but the structure is really key. And so, you're not going to get everything that you want from a wildlife standpoint from industrial forests, but you can work with folks to rearrange things, and a lot of the companies I've worked with are willing to make adjustments and help. So there is that aspect as well. I did want to ask about mycorrhizae and what level of emphasis my co-panelists have been putting on the importance of mycorrhizae in forests. Only because I'm reading books about it right now and going, oh my gosh.
Not me, Tony.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always mycorrhizae is cool because it was a cool thing, whatever, 40 years ago, and we're kind of back at it. And I think one of the cool parts of the previous wave of excitement was around like the role of small mammals and other organisms for dispersing spores into disturbed environments. And so it's pretty amazing, how quickly like a disturbed area gains new functional forms of mycorrhizae just by small mammals eating the truffles and pooping them out all over the landscape. And so I think it's a pretty resilient part of ecosystems that I think has kind of been pushed into maybe like super delicate because of some of the kind of anthropomorphism of it around like the mother tree, et cetera. But it's still something we need to think about. In particular, if you're going to completely get rid of all vegetation in an area, you're going to have some challenges. But more importantly, I think in the context of regeneration, if you're working in a forest and it's dominated by species that associate with arbuscular mycorrhizae, and now you're going to be planting in species that primarily associate with endomycorrhizae, ectomycorrhizae, you basically, need to be thinking through. There might be some, disadvantages initially for some of those trees as that, population and those relationships build up. And we've done some work looking at that a little bit. And it's a balance, there's positive and negative, fungal interactions happening in that root zone. And But there have been a couple species we've worked with where, it clearly was on a disadvantage relative to others based on like the mycorrhizal community being a bit different. But I think, what we found is that was a kind of a short-term dynamic, and over time, those as they acclimated and you got more of that hyphae building up in the soil, it wasn't as big an issue, but still a lot to learn on it. I guess I didn't mean to belittle it. I just feel, one thing that's been pretty amazing is work that Ryan Stevens and others have done just on how much, spore load is being dispersed across the landscape by small mammals, and how that, and how our forestry influences their behavior. So retaining trees, retaining understory, doing good ecological silviculture, I think creates the small mammal playground they need to go out there and do their thing. But
That's great.
Pretty dynamic, pool does recover fast.
In some places where we have a lot of invasive species, that also becomes a huge problem. I know Jeff Ward in Connecticut had done a lot of work, and they had planted out. Basically they were just collecting deer poop and putting that in nursery bins and growing it out. And he came up with some unbelievable number of invasive species that they ended up growing from just deer pellets. And so, and just a huge percentage was invasive species. So it's just interesting to think about. And again, these are in areas there's a lot of deer, there's not much regeneration. So they're eating a lot of the invasive species that they wouldn't have generally found the most palatable species initially, but it's just where we are. So it impacts the regeneration of deer. We're not speaking a lot about that, but it's just so huge. Yeah. So we still have just a couple minutes before we're going to start into the questions, and I see there's at least 16 questions in the Q&A, and our assistant regional forester from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the southeastern region, that's Haven Barnhill, is going to take us through some of those questions in a minute. But any kind of thoughts, you guys, before we head into the questions? Other stuff that snowpack is another thing you think about. I've been thinking about, there just isn't, Olivia was talking about moisture being such a key component, and especially in the understory. But you think about the places, when soil is being impacted and snowpack is being impacted, the impacts to how species adapt is just huge. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, on that, we funded research sort of looking at sort of species that are camouflaged, so like rough grouse or snowshoe hare, who no longer are subject to high predation because of the mismatch, and found that the way you manage the forest can reduce that predation risk and offset some of that increased loss due to snowpack, as well as the subnivean, those underground, under snow conditions that are really important for wildlife. Again, how much coarse woody debris or alternatives we maintain on the landscape can offset not having that snow as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly where I was hoping you would head, Olivia. Thank you. Other thoughts before we hit the questions?
Well, I'll just say we like that snowpack when we're trying to get some of those hybrid chestnut going up here, because the parent trees are from Virginia. That's the challenge again, is some of the so having snowpack to keep them happy, at least in a cold year like this, is critical. But yeah, from a regeneration standpoint, it's a huge challenge. And for herbivory impacts, I mean, we really see that pretty clearly of a paper coming out that really maps it out, that where there's less snowpack, there's heavier deer browse impact on seedlings. And so, trying to, accommodate that. Looks like there's a question around deer browse. I mean, it's a huge, and moose, just a big challenge. I think just writ large, regeneration is something that, if you look at like our ecological models, is the most poorly modeled phenomena from the vegetation side, because it's so unpredictable. So many things need to come together. And so I think all the challenges we're dealing with right now are just amplified by climate, but it's always been a tricky thing. Like, why did it work here? Why didn't it work there? And so I think, the more we can be paying attention to novel ways of getting this done, the better, just given how tough regeneration's always been if you weren't planting. And even that's
Yeah,
not easy.
yeah, and it seems like certain tree species are definitely more impacted by that. It seems like sugar maple, for instance, looks like it's a real loser from losing snowpack, so with that, let's Haven, bring us a few questions and we can let folks let our panel provide some guidance.
Excellent. We're getting some good questions in. If I could start with you, Carrie, I had a couple of questions pop up about the Eastern Seed Zone map and whether there was an equivalent out west, or if there's not an equivalent. How do you know when it's too far to move a seed within a zone, or what would guide your decision in the absence of a seed zone map?
So in the West, and I put a couple of links to those questions. I've been typing some of that in. The maps in the West, there are maps for the West, but you'll notice they're not as linear. In the East, they're pretty linear. But in the West, there is a seed zone map. It's called the provisional seed zones. And I think we put the link in there. The principle is the same. They don't want you to move seed more than 3 degrees centigrade, which turns out it's approximately 5 or 7 degrees Fahrenheit from that sort of becomes your transfer guidebook. So if you know where the seed is coming from, and if you know the mean annual temperature in the West, where it's coming from and where you're planting it, as long as it's within 3 degrees C, that is kind of a recommended transfer distance based on provenance trial data for most species. We don't have a guidebook yet for the West like we did for the East. It's actually a project I'd like to start doing this year with my colleagues in the West, those of us who are still here. It's a big undertaking, but yeah. Again, it's tracking the temperature, not moving it more than 3 degrees C or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are safe transfer distances. You go past that and now you're taking a bigger risk.
Thank you. I had a question about whether we can crosswalk some of the overarching tenets of ecological forestry, and how those are integrated or disconnected in terms of forest regeneration and reforestation.
Yeah, I mean, I view regeneration as a central process in an ecosystem, right? I mean, it really is what builds and rebuilds the amazing infrastructure for all that we care about. That's called a forest, and so whether we think of principles tied to continuity, so really thinking about like the pre and post disturbance condition, so much of that legacy is protecting regeneration during harvesting. Some of our species that we really get excited about and try to care for, like red spruce, or northern white cedar, those are slow, or western red cedar, those take a long time to get going and built up. And so trying where we can to kind of carry that forward into new areas if we're doing harvesting. Likewise, leaving seed sources, all those things that are critical, in terms of complexity and diversity, that's a key principle of ecological forestry. And the region layer is where a lot of that begins, from a species composition standpoint. So diverse seed sources, diverse genetics, if you can, in terms of timing, again, really thinking about ecological timeframes, how long does it take for a certain species to regenerate? If it needs really well decayed wood, it's going to take a while to even have the seedbed, or if you don't have the time to have that seedbed be present, can you do other things via site prep to create it? And then, obviously context, thinking about your landscape, as Carrie's mentioning, thinking about kind of broader climatic regimes. And so I'm biased to those 4 principles, but that, in terms of ecological forestry, regeneration underpins so much of it. And again, it's such a key, piece of keeping forests, providing all those benefits over the long run. So it should be a big area of emphasis, as it is, for this group.
I could follow up on that. So one of the concepts we've been promoting, not just we, Southeast, but generally across the country, and some folks may consider it kind of a cop-out, maybe, but we often talk about variable retention in terms of regenerating practices. And it drives some folks a little crazy. They're kind of like, I can predict exactly what I need with even age silviculture, or it's more natural to be doing uneven age silviculture, although I have some issues with that. The variable retention is basically just making judgments based on understanding the range of conditions you have, what you're lacking, what you need to be promoting. And to me, it's a really useful concept. One of the things I also want to point out is that when we talk about ecological forestry, I'll just sort of generally use the antithesis as production forestry, and it's not just production of fiber. Think about the slide I showed of the Bachman sparrow declining across most of its range. Obviously, it's associated beyond pine habitats, but that's the main habitat it's in. It's open pine. We're on the verge of doing a great job recovering red-cockaded woodpecker because we've really zeroed in on red-cockaded woodpecker and become very productive. It's essentially a production forestry approach that has maybe not paid as much attention to the ground cover that the Bachman sparrow and many other ground associates are. So ecological principles may not be promoting maximum red-cockaded woodpecker numbers. It may be once they're stable, making sure you're healthy populations, but putting more attention to the ground cover. It would be an ecological principle. And again, I just try to point out it's not one or the other.
Thank you, Chuck and Tony. We had a question. Are we losing birds or wildlife because of healthy forest and ecosystems are being destroyed? Did we always prune our forests back? I guess the question is, is management essential?
I guess I have strong feelings about that. I'll jump on that one too. I think I'll be bold and say I think we've lost a lot of bird populations, for instance, because of what people consider to be healthy forests that are closed canopy and have no structure. Many of the species require canopy gaps and understory structure, and so to some degree we may have lost some percentage of at least migratory birds and other wildlife by having both healthy forests that are young, vigorous, and closed canopy and no structure.
And I'm not a wildlife scientist, but I've been up to the Huron-Manistee National Forest, and the Kirtland warbler needs young jack pine. And so the only way to create that is to either let burns go through or clear cut and plant them at a very high density. And so that management, though, has been successful. So everyone's a different case of what the animal needs, what their needs are, and matching it with the environment and the conditions.
And I'll just add another way to talk about it is that we're seeing like biotic homogenization, and that we are seeing loss of diversity across the landscape, and sort of a movement to more of the same types of species that do well and have greater adaptive capacity to deal with forest management that's not suitable, that forest management, climate change, etc. So homogenization is another way to think about it.
We had a comment that before planting trees or even understory, it's important to develop long-term plans and establish desired conditions for the ecosystem, the landscape, and the local site. Then you can begin to get a feel for what the spacing or patchiness or arrangement may need to be for those specific objectives, whatever they are. What's the role in planning and determining desired conditions in making management decisions?
I mean, it's a guiding, tenet of what we're doing in a lot of places. And I think, my previous comment about do you start pulling, unique levers that you hadn't thought of before because your desired future condition is, sustaining a certain species. And so when you look at the vulnerability of the current tree species that are there or the ability to regenerate them, you feel like it's not going to be successful, or if it isn't, you have kind of a threshold that then triggers you to try other things from a planting or regeneration standpoint. But a lot of how we work with, and I'm kind of, I guess, trained and embedded within the climate change response framework, and just more broadly, how we think about management planning on federal lands, and often the desired future conditions are kind of the overarching framework for then under which we're developing the goals and objectives, and then specific tactics for that site. And so I think, to me, that might allow you to think a little bit more outside the box too, is to, as things get more wacky, what if we really still want that desired future condition, like how are we going to get there with the tools that we have as a management community? And I think that's when we might really need to think a bit outside the box in terms of what species or genotypes we're trying to get out there to sustain, priority species, wildlife species in the landscape. But yeah, I think it's super important.
Had a question, or somebody pointed out that the forests are so much more than trees. And is there much work being done involving assisted migration of understory species, or some of the non-economic species?
Not enough work.
Yeah, that is the answer. I know, like, our colleagues in Alaska really seeing the effects of climate change faster than us, are really concerned about berries and subsistence harvest and changes in phenology for berries. And I think we are due to do more of the same work.
Yeah, there's been huge movement though, I think in the native plant communities. And, again, those of us that have been more on like the tree, nursery perspective feel like, okay, now there's some that are catching up a bit with like diverse seed source, but even that, like some of those species are so tricky to propagate, let alone protect naturally. But I know there's at least the adaptive silviculture for climate change installation at the Jones Center. I'm pretty sure they're planting a couple grass varieties of different zones, just given the importance of, graminoids to those longleaf communities. But that's one example. I think writ large, we have a lot of learning and capacity to build there.
It's hard. They don't call them nurseries for nothing. It's hard to grow stuff in a nursery, and you have to think way ahead, especially a tree nursery. So if there's again, there has to be incentives to do that, and I don't think we're in a time when there are a lot of incentives for these kinds of things. We've been fortunate, some of the research we're doing now has been on, recognition that we needed research in these areas. I'm a little concerned that there may not be so many opportunities for that. But again, there are a lot of niche growers out there, but they can only grow stuff that they think they can get a return on their dollar for. So if we don't, if we can let them know ahead of time, and we know the kind of things that we need to move north, and we can get them to grow. But it's, again, it's a niche. The nursery niche is a tough one. It's a tough
one. I think Chuck mentioned desired forest conditions in bottomland hardwoods, and also the open pan rapid assessment GAD. Are there similar assessment GADs to GAD decision making for other major habitats or other parts of the country?
What?
Yeah.
Come on, guys.
Okay, too much silence.
Yep.
Try another one, Chuck, and we'll see if we, so I guess I wasn't sure what type of rapid assessment we're talking about. And also, just thinking about changing that a little bit. I mean, I'm thinking about what our FIA, our Forest Inventory and Analysis, looks at. You know, when they do a census every 7 years or so of every state, you know, you look back now at for the Mid-Atlantic, a species like red maple now makes up, you know, over 50% of the dominant trees in forests in many places. Although that species has always been on the landscape, I worked with uh, an academic, Grace Brush, who did soil cores and really sediment cores. And so she looked at the pollen. She has way more patience than most folks in looking at all the pollen. And red maple existed, you know, 200, 300 years ago in the pollen record, but it was, you know, maybe 1, 2% of the forest then. And now we're at 50% in many places. So that's a huge change. And that there may be climate components to that, but I suspect a lot of that, you know, it is management. We're not opening up the forest enough to allow oak regeneration. So these kind of assessments are important, and we know since 1956 we have assessments every 5 or 7 years of each state. You know, so we have a good 100-year history anyway of what our forests are doing. So.
So Jeff, just to follow up, but you know, you have some guidelines as to what you're trying to seek. So there's a document somewhere in the background that says you should be, you know, trying to, you know, regenerate so much hard mass or red oak or whatever, you know, whatever the range is, you know, 40 to 60% or something like that, right? So there are guidelines for uh, for what you're measuring against, correct? Or you're just measuring?
So in those, well, what I was talking about was, you know, just a census, right? But of course, there are guidelines for a lot. You know, we go back to our Gingrich Roach tables to look at how we want to grow oak, for instance. But again, that's based on a certain series of assumptions. And again, what did our forest look like? You know, at what
Mhm.
snapshot in time are you looking at for those forests? You know, they're changing rapidly. We have a good history for the last, you know, since around you know, the 1800s. But beyond that, if you're not looking at pollen cores or something, you really don't know what it looked like. We it used to be great debates, but then again, my friend Dr. Grace Brush would always win the debates when she brought up her pollen. I used to argue with her. I know better now. So.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a question in the chat that along the lines that Haven brought up about especially snags and cavities, and there's quite a few papers in all different forest types about you know, snag and cavities and desired um, amounts of different size classes. You know, I can probably, I mean, I'm sure there's
Oh yeah,
a
yeah.
potential literature search for that sort of thing.
Um, I'm going to combine a couple of questions dealing with resiliency. And uh, one question is, would resiliency of our forest plantings be enhanced if we were to increase the diversity of this composition that we're planting to include soft mast or shrubs or undercover species with varying densities or patchiness? And to that also is a comment about our ability to improve climate resilient forest species diversity is tied to the forest product marketability of those species down the road. And so what are folks thinking about in terms of downturns in or changes in wood markets and how that may impact resilient forest management?
So Jeff Denman could probably answer that question. He's one of the people asking that. Uh, you know, and again, so what your objectives are, you know, obviously industry is trying to, you know, push out a product really quickly, but a lot of times there's some big risk about, you know, planting monocultures and densely planting in places where there's fire risk, as somebody had mentioned earlier. So the more diverse the plantings, the more, in terms of species composition and structure, the more options you have for, if you're paying close attention, what's working, what's not. And as climate effects become more and more prevalent, you can see what doing better in a particular species range, which species of oaks are doing better, which soft mass species are doing better over time. So you can think about running your own experiments along those lines. And Tony's kind of the king of those kinds of experiments, so I'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, I mean, I think diversity is always the key, right? If, in terms of thinking, I think the question's been brought up already that like we're pretty heavy on trees, but obviously we want to be thinking about other life forms and including those in part of these conversations, and especially even on some tough sites, that like shrubs and other plantings can actually sometimes enhance seedling success. There's a balance there, but some of our wetter sites and also some of our more like droughty sites, a little bit of cover is not a bad thing initially, and so thinking through where you can take advantage of positive relationships. But in terms of the wood market piece, I mean, I think right now, we've already seen it play out. There are huge regions of the country where they say, "Oh, you just need to, if you could just thin the forest, or do other things." I mean, I think we're beyond that scale wise, but there are markets already to do just general management in areas, let alone think about using new species or new products. So I think there's some historic examples of once you lose that tool and you get into the mode of like having to subsidize acre by acre treatment, it becomes really tricky and obviously controversial in terms of whether that's the right course forward. And so being engaged, as we are in this community and thinking about adaptation and tailoring it to individual sites, there has to be an economic component to it to make it feasible. I think the biggest challenge is just knowing what the market is, when that tree finally is mature. You think of just how dynamic markets have been in certain regions, even aspen, in the 60s was not, they're just, still not a popular tree in the lake states. And now it's, centered to so many industries. So I think that's why diversity is important, because it's similar to markets and outputs. And so I think some do get worried when we're talking about planting certain tree species that don't have huge economic value. But again, sometimes it's for the function, and that's, that sometimes has a measurable value in terms of the human services and ecological services it provides. And so we do need to kind of balance those things and not always like measure the quality of the tree we're planting based on can it become a future forest product, recognizing though that we need those markets and we need like management, like infrastructure to exist in areas to pull a lot of this off. So here's the hope, and it sticks around in a lot of places that are suffering right now.
Well, and having worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I mean, we only do silviculture if it's related to benefiting wildlife habitat. I mean, that's the only time we're allowed to do it. It has, so we have to show that objective every time. Tony, I thought you might want to say maybe something about the principles of kind of ecological forestry, because it seems like that comes back into, that same question about diversity, how we look at the legacy of what's there and what models are we looking at?
Yeah, and I kind of, I guess, awkwardly weaved in a little bit when Haven was asking that question. But I mean, we think of, kind of four principles, continuity, complexity, diversity, timing, and context, and so those all operate at different scales. But I think, Chuck's comment about like retention harvesting and trying to build that into what you're doing, even like when we think about the advent of that practice, historically, it really was, for the biodiversity and to some degree aesthetic benefits of carrying forward mature legacies and other structures into a new regenerated forest. But now in the context of adaptation, this also could be a safe site. It could be the one spot that doesn't totally fry, when it's 100 degrees, and you've just planted that area. And so it can be an important feedback, with your regeneration activities, et cetera. And I think the other principles really get at both the need for diversity, but also to be paying attention to like the processes that are playing out across the landscape and how those are varying in space and time. And some you can control and anticipate, and others you have to respond to, but doing it in ways that I still kind of center those desired future conditions and kind of the mission that you're trying to achieve in those areas. So, I mean, I'm biased, but I think the principles, a lot of relevance to today as they did, when they were focused mostly on biodiversity, but I can throw a paper in the chat that kind of crosswalks some of those ideas to thinking about adaptation. So
that would be great.
Let's try to get a couple more real quick. Talking about a lot of really big issues that take years of research and understanding. Can you guide those of us who are looking to reforest our tiny little spaces that have been destroyed by invasives or other degradation? Here in my area, we've begun that process, and we want to do the right thing by creating a healthy ecosystem in our little small space. Where do we start?
I'll just open generally and leave it for the forest adaptation folks to respond. But that oftentimes we sort of we have more information than we think, and we have enough information to act. We are often acting and making decisions under uncertainty, and climate change is not much different than sort of the current decisions that we make related to natural resource management. But sometimes we treat it a little differently, as if there's there's a lot of information, especially in forest management and adaptation. And two, using your professional judgment on what you know about the site and the conditions and your priorities can get you a really long way. You just sort of needing to set aside the time and attention. And then with that, like turning to Tony or Chuck or Carrie, like there are some best practices that you can implement, particularly for forest systems. So.
Well, one advantage of having a relatively small, and I'm not sure, what you're referring to is small, but, somebody else had brought up the issue of invasives, kind of coming in and capturing a site after there's been some disturbance. That's always going to be an issue in the South and a lot of other places, where you have to, be ready to combat the invasives to allow the, native vegetation to grab hold and so forth. But you got a smaller area, you've got maybe one advantage in being able to more readily control the invasives. And then, understand the areas surrounding that site. And again, the range of variation and composition and structure can help guide you for what you might want to do on your small patch. And this might be also something that, looking at natural communities guides and, that might be relevant to your area to give you an idea of where you want to try to, gear your site towards. Those are just some general thoughts.
Carrie, looked like you were going to have mentioned something. Okay.
No, not yet.
David, we have 2 minutes.
We are right up at the clock. I'd like to quickly plug next month's webinar, Managing Forest for Bat Habitat. We'll have some good panelists, Dr. Susan Loeb, mammologist retired from the Forest Service, Southeastern Research Station, and Professor Emeritus at Clemson University, Dr. Mark Ford with USGS, Pete Padavina with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so it should be an excellent webinar. And with that, Jeff, would you like to close us out?
Sure. First, I wanted to thank our panel. You guys did a great job. You ran with it great. I hope folks got a lot out of today's conversation. I certainly did. So again, thanks to that. Again, thanks to Amanda for her wonderful leadership in this. And we're going to hope she's going to hang out with us more in the future. So at any rate, we thank everyone for participating. If it weren't for you guys, we wouldn't be here. So we appreciate it so much. Again, hope to see you on March 18th. Again, we're here every Tuesday, every third Tuesday of the month, every third Tuesday of the month. And thank you for participating. And again, thanks to our panel. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Olivia. Thank you, Chuck. You guys did a wonderful job. And Haven, thanks for running the questions. And thank you to our interpreters. That's nice.
Absolutely.
Having that. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.